All right, everybody, we are back with all of our presenters from this morning. So this is our panel. If you guys have questions, there is a Q&A section on the right side of your screen where you can post your question that we can get answered from the panelists for you. Just want to make sure you're using that specific Q&A section and not the chat so we can see it right, okay? So to start, everyone, again, amazing presentations this morning. We learned so much from spiritual aspects to what it means to love yourself to some fetishes, new words that we got, some new words, and then also a really great musicology lesson on breaking down some of the songs from the Love Symbol album or the Love Symbol album. So my first question, I know a lot of you guys kind of touched on this, but do you see a difference in the way Prince presents himself from Diamonds and Pearls to the Symbol album? I know some folks said, stylistically or musically, it seemed very clean or overproduced, depending on how you feel about it. But more from a persona perspective, do you see a difference there, or do you find those two eras are kind of the same? And this is for anyone.
I'll jump in. I think they're vastly different. Yeah, like I said in my presentation, he had a much darker edge, and I think he was starting to enter that era, going into Come, and the Vault, and he was starting to get angrier, and that fueled some really really great edgy work. So Diamonds and Pearls is kind of like a soft breaking in of the new power generation, and then they really started to really develop. It's a significant evolution in the sound of the band, I think, and it's a lot harder and edgier. And it's really they're both excellent, but just I find Diamonds and Pearls is quite light and breezy and fun in a different way. Symbol album is fun, but it's like really dangerous fun. That's how I'd put it.
Okay. And I think you were breaking up a little bit in the end there, but I think we got the gist of what you said. I'm going to ask this of Erica as well, because I know your area of Prince is in his spirituality. Do you see any differences between the Diamonds and Pearls and the Symbol era?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, following Graffiti Bridge, Diamonds and Pearls was quite a departure in terms of his spiritual message, even though it was still a little bit there with Thunder. I mean, you still had the mention of Jesus, but then, especially with songs like Live for Love, you're starting to see that transition of being really explicit about God and being more general about love. But going into the Love Symbol album, that's really when you start to see the Eastern spirituality come in. So it is quite a difference. And then also, he had already been kind of emphasizing love over lust, like really going back to the Sign of the Times album. But between Diamonds and Pearls and Love Symbol, and you could, chalk this up to his relationship with Maite maybe, but you really see that influence of focusing on love and monogamy. And he even said in an interview, like, Sexy MF is about monogamy and marriage. So yeah, it's quite a difference between those two projects.
All right, anybody else want to chime in on that question?
Yeah, and I want to apologize to everybody for just my picture up. I hope folks can hear me. I'm traveling between Mississippi and Louisiana, so that's why my picture is up. Just to say that I often looked at the Love Symbol album and Diamonds and Pearls kind of like a correlation between Dirty Mind and Controversy, where Prince laid some foundations with Dirty Mind and then expounded upon those ideas in Controversy. Same thing, he laid some ideas in Dirty Mind and then kind of expounded upon them, right? Where where Diamonds and Pearls is a really pretty much judo Christian type of work. And with the Love Symbol album, as Sister Thompson said, he expounds into a more Eastern and a more Afrocentric time. So just another example how he was always growing.
I love it. I love it. We got a question from the chat from Mr. Michael Dean of the podcast on Prince. What are your thoughts about the Kirstie Alley segments?
I like them. I think that coming back to my presentation, Prince has always had this kind of adversarial relationship with the press. So it's no surprise that she plays an antagonist, and she also plays to to use Dr. Sherry's notion, she kind of fetishizes Prince, right? In a way that the press has kind of fetishized Prince, having this kind of, they admire him, but they also have anger with him because he won't be in the box that they want him to be in. And so I think that Kirstie Alley plays that role well as not a foil necessarily, but as a way for Prince to kind of examine, why do we like what we like from an aesthetic thing? And he's examining why do we like from an aesthetic thing by looking at, why do critics always choose a one singular way to portray him, as well, rather than being a little bit more expansive in how they would address him and the way they would address other artists. And I always have to go there, and particularly how they would address white artists, right? That it seemed to be that black artists always gets this kind of flat, one-dimensional portrayal from rock critics, and Prince is really questioning that through Kirstie Alley.
Okay. Anybody else want to hop in on that question?
I think they're fun, and it sort of gives Prince an opportunity to advance his character, show like a bit of his personality. It's not his real personality. He's still playing a certain version of Prince, but it just goes to show his playfulness. He's messing with it. It's a bit like the kid in Purple Rain or Graffiti Bridge. He's not necessarily like the nicest guy, and he likes to sort of mess with people's heads, and he's doing the same thing there. And I think there's definitely an echo of a real life character trait there. But I think those segments are fun. And yeah, I like Kirstie Alley. She's got a great voice.
I think what I keep referring to is how she is bringing up Maite's age. It's used on the album, it's used in the video, it's used on the tour, where the journalist keeps saying, Maite's 16 years old. And she's trying to make this into a tabloid headline, So I think it's a way of Prince creating the controversy, but it also forces you to think about, what are your boundaries? What are your thoughts on this whole idea of what is your age? What does, age is nothing but a number. So it doesn't matter if she's 16 or 350 years old. So whenever I think of the Kirstie Alley segments, I think of she's trying to stay on this age issue.
Yeah, it's definitely the elephant in the room about this album, and thinking through what would happen if this album came out today. Would those same messages be there, and how would Prince even address it at all, or just kind of let people deal with it? But I did have some additional questions for you, Dr. Sherry. What kind of brought you to this topic as far as discussing this album and in its way of the fetishes?
Okay. So it's sort of biographical, but not the BDSM part.
I should say, I mean, with your consent of whatever you want to share.
Oh, I know. Because I know people are thinking like, okay, so what does she do? Because she's talking about this. So it's knowing people in the community that practice different forms of sexuality, that practice different forms of what arouses them. And I think it was me exploring how much of this is truly Prince being completely open and saying, yes, I like these things turn me on. And how much of it was a character that he was playing, that he's like, it's not me, it's this character, the demon lover, the rough boy, or not rough boy, rude boy. Rude means two things. Rude, well, it means more than two things, but in the BDSM community, rude could mean just being rough with someone, or rude could be you violated a rule, a consensual rule. Like, you touched me somewhere you weren't supposed to touch me, or you took my stuff and you weren't supposed to touch, take my stuff, right? So Rude Boy is something that goes way back. I don't know if that's him or if that's a character that he's playing. So that was my exploration for it.
No, I understand, because I know the topic comes up sometimes, and it's all throughout his music, and it's definitely to sensuality,
Mhm.
sexuality, eroticism, spirituality. So it's all kind of in the soup of Prince.
And one thing I did like after I finished this is he really does emphasize consent. He really emphasizes, okay, I'm watching you, but you know that I'm watching you. And when he goes in the movie, in the film, Sexy Motherfucker, he goes in the hotel room, he shuts the door, and she could just turn around and go. And she decides, I'm going to go into this room. And then she sees, hello, there's a party going on. And then she goes, okay, yeah, we're going to do this. So I liked in that video how he is showing consent. He's showing, even if you are in a submissive position, you still have power. You still have, at any time, you could say no, and you can go. So that was something nice, that he is emphasizing consent all the way through.
Amen. Okay.
Sister KaNisa, could I just add one point to that?
Sure.
Because I think what Dr. Cherry is doing is important, and I think the other thing is that a good number of Prince's songs that seemingly are about sex on the surface are not when you analyze them. Prince was really interested in the way that most songwriters use other metaphors to discuss sex. Prince was using sex as a metaphor to address neurosis, right? Whether you take a song like Little Red Corvette, it's really dissecting the human, the male neurosis that men sometimes don't know if we want to sex women or save them, right? Because if you think about the lyrics of Little Red Corvette, right, the first half is, you need to slow down, you out there too tough, you whatever. But then at the end, it's like, well, does he really want her to slow down simply because he wants to be the only driver? So what's really happening there? And even when you take Lady Cab Driver, it's very clear that the sex in Lady Cab Driver is about escapism. It's about, and so I think that these discussions are important, because if you actually look at the lyrics, right, Prince was very clear that he understood that he was, I always tell my creative writing students, there's a difference between erotica and poem, right? And we talk about in the literary sense, and I'm not saying one is bad or anything, I'm just saying that poem is strictly about sexual stimulation. Erotica is about understanding the neurosis tied to sexual stimulation. So it's, why do people have the types of sex that they have? And how is your approach to sex an indicator of your particular personality? And I think that Prince, in connecting all of the spirituality, was really doing a lot more with that. But because most people go to popular music and they think, well, popular culture is about being mindless, no one wants to take those kind of deep dives. And I saw in the chat, I don't want to belabor, but somebody put in the chat about, what would Prince think about these educated guesses or these deep dives? I can tell you, when he invited me to Paisley Park, he loved it. Prince wasn't anti analysis of his work. He was anti-simplified and non-nuanced analysis of his work. But when he invited me in the talks that we had over 18 months, he talked about a lot of people who would analyze his work. He would say that person got it or that person didn't get it. So he enjoyed it. So I'll shut up now.
No, I think that's really important, because it's people think about Prince and they see him on the surface, but all the reflection that comes from his songs, the things that you feel, the trauma it puts you through, the memories that you connect to those songs, it's deep, and it's very revelatory of how you move through the world and why you think of the things that you do. And I think he's a really good agitator to make you think about things that made you uncomfortable, because that means there's something to learn there, right? So we have a question, Miss Camila Cummings, who we'll hear from later in the symposium. This is for Erica. As a journalist, what do you think about Prince's acknowledgement of the press throughout his work? Have other artists done that to this degree?
Yeah, hey Camila. It's a little triggering sometimes as a reporter, because Prince could be very playful with the press and very dismissive of the press. But I think I don't know. I think he chose Kirstie Alley to go back to that question as a white woman. I'm not sure that he would have cast a black woman in that role because I think he had a very different relationship with the white critics as he did with the black critics. So, but I think that's a great question about have other artists done that to the same extent? Probably. I'm sure we could probably find examples, but so I guess I would say through the music, it just seems in most instances he's talking to white critics who have had more of a platform to discuss his work, and I don't know that he's addressing black critics to the same extent within his music. So I think that's my answer to that question.
Okay. Another question from the audience from Miss Nadine. Shout out Atlanta. Why is Prince's contribution to the artistry of songwriting not acknowledged at large? This has baffled me forever. Any takes on this one?
Yeah, now just because unfortunately most of the people who are doing the acknowledging have traditionally been white rock critics, and they just have not acknowledged, right, people like Stevie Wonder and Smokey Robinson. It took Bob Dylan to say that Smokey Robinson is America's greatest poet, and so while Lennon and McCarthy, and rightfully so, Lennon and McCarthy get a lot of credit. They should get a lot of credit. But I think that when at the beginning, when white critics were addressing popular music, it was understood that rock and roll was for the body and the mind, while R&B, blues, and funk was just for the mind. And they did not understand that from an African sense, that Africans always had a difference between sensuality and sexuality. And that is where the real intellectual analysis happens. It's just that far too many of the critics analyzing, particularly white critics analyzing black music, did not understand the dichotomy between body and soul and sensuality and sexuality. That's why somebody like Mavis Staples and the Staples Singers, right, doing these kind of religious, spiritual connections was missed, because a lot of white critics only heard the moaning and groaning and didn't understand that that kind of moaning and groaning was sensual and not sexual in the church.
Amen. Amen. Any other ones want to drop into that question?
Yeah, it's that was a great answer, Liegh. I loved that. The first thing that jumped into my mind was someone like Kurt Cobain, who is a great songwriter and gets a lot of kudos for it, as opposed to somebody like Prince, who was like around for a lot longer. And I think maybe it's easy to overlook this stuff when there is so much glitz and glamour and so many other aspects. If Prince was just sort of sitting in a corner with a guitar all the time and all his albums were like the truth and there was sort of like nothing to distract you from the songwriting, maybe it would be more appreciated. But because there is so much there, he's like a real complete package when it comes to his stardom and his performance style. Yeah, it gets a bit overlooked, and also because he's so diverse, he's got a lot of like fun, funky songs that people can sort of dance to and not have to think about on a very deep level. And then he has this whole other side where he is writing about philosophy and religion and really deep stuff, and it's just easy to overlook that stuff when it's not being sort of forced at you. It's not emphasized in the way in what he puts out. The Cream video is not showcasing like the deepest song on Diamonds and Pearls, but that's how he sells the records.
Yeah. So while you're up, Adam, I'm actually gonna pull another question from the audience for you from Miss TLC.
Yeah, sure.
So considering that Prince is a talented musician, for Adam, let me just read it. Considering that he's a talented musician himself, what is his personal take on the idea that the era is too glossy and overproduced? Clearly appreciates the creative chord progression, but would you have preferred an edit on this?
I don't know. Like, I have to say, like, Diamonds and Pearls is where I got on the train, so it just sounds. I listened to music very differently back then because I was, a teenager, and I just took everything for what it was. I've developed far more judgment in my later years, and as my analytical skills grew, maybe I've formed some opinions. But no, I think it was just a choice, and I don't think he takes it too far. I think maybe for my personal taste, he took it too far in the later years. I don't think the last couple of albums, production-wise, probably since like 2010, it's particularly soulless for me in terms of the production. But I still think there's heaps of life in this, and all the layering and things that I was talking about in my presentation really create so much interest. And I think it's really wonderful, and it is different from the layering of Love Sexy. Love Sexy is a very dense record as well, but it does sound a bit different. But one thing that I didn't really have time to talk about in the presentation was the fact that there are a lot of new technologies available. And during the Batman album, he got all these new samplers and things. So he was really playing with new toys that he had. So that's one reason why it sounds different. And then, he was switching to Pro Tools and mixing digitally as well, eventually, when that became available. So it was a real change in his workflow that brought about the changes in the sound of those records. I mean, I think he would have done all that stuff earlier if he could, but it was logistically difficult. And it's quite amazing what he was able to achieve with the help of people like Susan Rogers on Sign of the Times, with all the slowed down, detuned backing vocals, and those amazing production techniques would have been such a pain in the ass to do back then, whereas you can just do them on GarageBand now. Anybody could do them in their bedroom.
Okay. Let me see. Lots of questions in the Q&A. We'll go with Mr. Ricky Wyatt, Grown Folks Podcast. Shout out. His question: thoughts on the political nature of the tune "Sacrifice of Victor," musically and lyrically?
Well, I know in my presentation, I stated that the Sacrifice of Victor is not just the crescendo of the album. It is Prince returning home to African-American culture and the church, right? The church being the foundation, a bedrock of the civil rights movement. And so it is Prince showing his intellect by using the chords, basically, of gospel freedom song chords, using the language of freedom movement. And so it really is his kind of line in the sand of, I'm going to really start, I'm going to really start being what others would consider more tangibly Black, right? Now, those of us who had been, Prince fans since the beginning, we cringe at that. What does it mean to be tangibly Black? Because that simply means someone has a very narrow notion of what it means to be Black. But yeah, I think that Sacrifice of Victor is that line in the sand of, I'm acknowledging being from the Black church. I'm acknowledging being from a Black community. I'm acknowledging being a child of the civil rights movement. And I'm also saying that, having all that with me, from now on, I'm going to be an artist who's going to have that explicitly embedded in my lyrics rather than implicitly.
Yeah, and to add on to what Seeley said, and I know Seeley has written about this too, but I see it as one example of Prince communicating Black liberation theology with, Black folks triumphing over being oppressed and being seen as sort of a chosen people, and that, Jesus is advocating for people who are oppressed. And Black people are certainly oppressed. So I see the song as an example of that. And I put this in the chat too. It's kind of like, Prince is talking to everyone, but in certain songs, he's especially talking to Black people and giving Black people encouragement to keep going, and then also giving them a vision of a life where they can truly be free.
Okay. We have about 5 minutes. I have a couple more questions, maybe 2 more questions. So this is for Sherry and Erica, really. So kind of going back to the concept of eroticism or fetishism. We kind of think through the tours that Prince had, right? And the Act 1 and Act 2 tours. You can almost argue that this might be the last time he is that sexual on stage. So what do you think about how it kind of fell out of his public performance? around this time, or what are your thoughts about why that may be the case?
I think he was a different person. I think he is now that symbol and that identity. And I agree with what's been said earlier that that is an old self, an old identity. He's refined, he's, more complex. So I see that as you don't expect to see that in future, concerts, because that's not him anymore.
I would say, and KaNisa, it's funny because I know you and I have talked about this. Like, it didn't totally fall out of his live performance. Like, there's still some uncomfortable "Darling Nikki" moments in like 2000. But to go with what Dr. Sherry said too, I mean, it's a combination of maturity, because he's been like really frank in interviews by saying, people are bringing their children to the show. I'm not going to do everything that I used to do, but at the same time, it's also spiritual transformation, depending on where he was in his spiritual journey. So of course, as he gets involved with the Jehovah's Witness faith, that has an effect on what he does. But those elements never totally go away. I think, what is the video where he's still blindfolded? I think from the Planet Earth album.
Somewhere Here on Earth.
Yeah, see, So those elements never really go away. They're just kind of pushed down at certain times.
Yeah, I hear that, because I'm just thinking through, I think I saw 2014 where he's like this and kneeling down, like, "What are you doing? What is this?"
Well,
But I
just
really
as a reminder, like, fetish is just attraction and arousal. It's not sexual. You like the feel of satin. You like the look of a mask. I remember, I was watching the Prince podcast, and they were talking to Prince's wardrobe designer, and I just forgot her name, but Prince said he liked to wear things on his head and on his neck. It felt good. That's why he liked scarves and hats and masks and chains, because he liked the feel of it. So it wasn't sexual, it was sensual. It's the texture and the weight and things like that.
I definitely think that's an important distinction to make as well, for sure. Okay. So we have about 2 minutes left. Let's see if we can get one more question answered. So, Richard Cole, the Amari podcast. Do you think this era would be best represented by a box set that covers both DNP and Symbol albums with a separate reissue of the albums, or super deluxe for each album? Just some wishes out there. Any thoughts about this one quickly?
That's a good question. I wouldn't be mad either way. I think that Prince often thought in companion pieces, right? And you could even not just companion songs, but companion albums. So if you wanted to group those together, I wouldn't have a problem with it. Or if they did them separately, because Prince was always thinking about narrative, and because he was always thinking about narrative, he was always thinking about how these things fit in a kind of arcing sort of way.
Quickly,
Could
I'll
you-
just say I want to see them separately. That's it.
Could you even throw in? I know it's technically not New Power Generation on the title, but could you throw in Graffiti Bridge as well and have a triple set? It's got the overproduced experience.
Hey. Okay.
I was kidding. I said I like that stuff.
Okay, I think we have 1 minute left, so I think we'll close it. Thank you, everybody. This was an amazing blockbuster of a first panel for our symposium today.
Thank you, everyone.
If D'Angela jumps back in here, but thank you for your time, everyone.